Welcome back to Hold On, Survival Stories, where we uncover the most incredible tales of human endurance that most people have never heard the full truth about. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the greatest maritime survival stories in history, a story that's been twisted by Hollywood, but whose real truth is far more extraordinary than any movie could capture. Before we begin this incredible journey, grab your headphones and get ready for an epic tale. We're about to travel back to 1789 to witness one of the most famous mutinies in naval history and the survival story that followed. 47 days in an open boat, 3,600 miles across the Pacific Ocean, with 19 men who should have died but refused to give up. If you're new to Hold On Survival Stories, we specialize in bringing you the true accounts of real people who faced impossible odds and found strength they never knew they possessed. We cut through the myths and legends to show you what actually happened when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances. Today's story takes us aboard HMS Bounty, where a mission to transport breadfruit plants became one of history's most famous mutinies. But this isn't really a story about the mutiny. It's about what happened after. It's about Captain William Bligh and 18 loyal men who were cast adrift in a tiny boat and accomplished one of the most remarkable feats of seamanship and survival ever recorded. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is the true story of how Captain Bligh navigated 3,600 miles of open ocean in a 23-foot boat, kept 18 men alive for 47 days on starvation rations, and proved that extraordinary leadership and navigation skills can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Captain William Bligh was 34 years old in 1787 when he was given command of HMS Bounty and what seemed like a simple mission: sail to Tahiti, collect breadfruit plants, and transport them to the Caribbean to provide cheap food for slaves on British plantations. It was supposed to be a routine voyage for an experienced officer who had sailed with Captain James Cook and proven himself as one of the Royal Navy's most skilled navigators. But Bligh carried with him a reputation that would prove both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. He was known throughout the Navy as a demanding, perfectionist commander who expected absolute discipline and precision from his crew. His tongue was as sharp as any weapon, and he had no patience for incompetence or insubordination. To his supporters, Bligh was a brilliant navigator and seaman whose high standards produced results. To his critics, he was a brutal tyrant who drove men beyond endurance with his impossible demands and cutting sarcasm. The truth, as often happens, was more complex than either extreme suggested. The Bounty herself was a small ship, just 90 feet long, cramped and uncomfortable for extended voyages. She had been converted from a merchant vessel and was not built for the kind of long-distance sailing that the breadfruit mission would require. The ship's size meant that the 46-man crew would be living in close quarters for months, with little privacy and constant contact that could amplify any personality conflicts. Bligh's second-in-command was Fletcher Christian, a young gentleman midshipman who had sailed with Bligh before and was considered a promising officer. Christian was popular with the crew, charming and charismatic in ways that contrasted sharply with Bligh's stern professional demeanor. The relationship between these two men would determine the fate of everyone aboard the Bounty. The voyage to Tahiti took 10 months, during which Bligh's demanding leadership style created growing tension among the crew. He was obsessed with cleanliness, discipline, and efficiency, conducting daily inspections that could result in public humiliation for anyone whose equipment or quarters didn't meet his exacting standards. Bligh's verbal discipline was legendary and feared throughout the ship. He could deliver tongue lashings that reduced grown men to tears, publicly cataloging their failures and inadequacies with a precision that cut deeper than any physical punishment. In an era when brutal physical discipline was common, Bligh's psychological warfare was actually more humane, but it was also more personally devastating. The crew's resentment of Bligh's methods intensified during their 5-month stay in Tahiti, where they experienced a tropical paradise that contrasted dramatically with the rigid discipline of shipboard life. The Tahitian lifestyle was relaxed, sensual, and free from the constant demands and criticisms that characterized life under Bligh's command. Many crew members formed relationships with Tahitian women and began to see the island as an alternative to the harsh realities of naval service. The prospect of returning to Bligh's demanding regime and eventually to the grim realities of 18th-century English life became increasingly unappealing as their time in paradise extended. Bligh, meanwhile, focused on the mission with his characteristic intensity. He successfully collected over 1,000 breadfruit plants and prepared them for the long voyage to the Caribbean. His attention to detail and scientific knowledge ensured that the plants would survive the journey, fulfilling the primary objective of their expedition. But Bligh's success in completing the breadfruit mission was overshadowed by his failure to maintain crew loyalty during their extended stay in Tahiti. His continued demands for naval discipline in a tropical paradise, combined with his harsh treatment of any perceived infractions, created resentment that festered during the months of relative leisure. The contrast between life in Tahiti and life under Bligh's command became stark and increasingly difficult for the crew to accept. Where Tahitian society was relaxed and forgiving, Bligh was demanding and critical. Where the island offered freedom and pleasure, the ship promised months of confinement and harsh discipline. Fletcher Christian found himself caught between his duty as an officer and his sympathy for the crew's resentment of Bligh's methods. His position as second-in-command made him a natural focus for crew complaints about their captain, while his personal relationship with Bligh made him acutely aware of the growing tension aboard the ship. When the Bounty finally departed Tahiti on April 4, 1789, she carried not just breadfruit plants, but also the seeds of mutiny that had been planted during their long stay in paradise. The crew's resentment of Bligh's leadership had reached a breaking point, and the captain's continued harsh treatment of his men during the early days of their departure would trigger one of the most famous mutinies in naval history. Bligh had no idea that his demanding leadership style, which had made him an effective naval officer, had also made him the target of a conspiracy that would soon leave him fighting for his life in the vast Pacific Ocean. The same perfectionist standards and sharp tongue that had built his reputation were about to destroy his command and test his survival skills in ways he could never have imagined. The captain who demanded absolute discipline from his crew was about to discover what it meant to depend entirely on his own skills and determination when everything he had built as a naval officer was stripped away, leaving him nothing but an open boat and the men who had remained loyal to the crown. The explosion came at dawn on April 28, 1789, just 3 weeks after leaving Tahiti. Captain Bligh was sleeping in his cabin when he was awakened by armed men bursting through his door. In an instant, the most famous mutiny in naval history had begun, and Bligh found himself facing the barrel of a cutlass held by Fletcher Christian, the man he had trusted as his second in command. "Mr. Christian!" Bligh shouted, his naval authority asserting itself even as he faced immediate mortal danger. "What is the meaning of this violence?" Christian's response would become part of maritime legend. "That, Captain Bligh, you know very well." The young officer's face was a mask of determination and desperation, the expression of a man who had passed the point of no return and was committed to a course that could end with his execution for treason. The mutiny was swift and decisive. Christian had carefully planned the takeover, securing the support of key crew members and ensuring that Bligh's loyal officers were overwhelmed before they could organize resistance. Within minutes, the ship was under mutineer control, and Bligh found himself a prisoner aboard his own vessel. What followed was a tense standoff that would determine the fate of everyone aboard the Bounty. Christian and his supporters wanted to return to Tahiti and the life of freedom they had experienced there, but they faced the problem of what to do with Bligh and the men who remained loyal to the Crown. Killing Bligh would have been the simplest solution from the mutineers' perspective, eliminating the witness who could testify against them and the leader who might organize resistance. But Christian, despite his rebellion against authority, was not a murderer. The decision to spare Bligh's life would prove crucial for the survival story that followed. Instead of execution, Christian chose exile. He ordered the ship's launch to be prepared, a 23-foot open boat that was never designed for ocean voyaging, but represented the only alternative to death for Bligh and his supporters. It was a decision that seemed to offer the mutineers a clean conscience while still eliminating the threat posed by loyal crew members. 18 men chose to join Bligh in the boat rather than remain with the mutineers. These were sailors who valued their oath to the Crown above the immediate comfort and freedom that staying with the Bounty would provide. They faced the choice between certain comfort with the mutineers and possible death with their captain, and they chose loyalty over survival. The provisioning of the launch became a critical factor in the survival story that would follow. Christian, perhaps motivated by guilt or a desire to give Bligh a fighting chance, allowed more supplies than strictly necessary for a death sentence. The boat was loaded with 150 pounds of bread, 16 pieces of salt pork, 6 quarts of rum, 6 bottles of wine, and 28 gallons of water. These supplies, while generous for a ship's boat, were woefully inadequate for 19 men facing an ocean voyage of unknown duration. The water would last perhaps 10 days if carefully rationed, while the food might sustain them for 2 weeks at starvation levels. Beyond that, they would depend entirely on their ability to find land or encounter rescue. Bligh's navigation equipment was limited to a quadrant, a compass, and his own extensive knowledge of seamanship and Pacific geography. He had no charts of the area they would traverse, no chronometer for accurate longitude calculation, and no detailed maps of the islands that might offer sanctuary. The emotional impact of being cast adrift was devastating for all involved. The men in the boat faced almost certain death in one of the most hostile environments on Earth.
The mutineers faced the knowledge that they had likely condemned 19 men to death while also making themselves fugitives who would be hunted by the Royal Navy for the rest of their lives. As the Bounty sailed away, leaving the small boat bobbing in the vast Pacific, Bligh faced the greatest challenge of his naval career. He was responsible for 18 men whose lives depended entirely on his ability to navigate thousands of miles of ocean in an open boat while managing limited supplies and maintaining morale among men who might slowly starve to death. The immediate challenge was psychological as much as physical. The men in the boat had to transition from being part of a ship's crew with defined roles and routines to being castaways whose survival depended on cooperation, discipline, and faith in their captain's abilities. Bligh's leadership style, which had contributed to the mutiny, would now be tested in circumstances where failure meant death for everyone involved. The same demanding perfectionism that had alienated his crew would prove essential for organizing their survival efforts and maximizing their chances of reaching safety. The tiny boat that rode the Pacific swells contained 19 men who faced one of the most daunting survival challenges in maritime history. They had no radio, no modern safety equipment, no way to signal for help. Their survival would depend entirely on Bligh's navigation skills, their collective discipline in rationing supplies, and their determination to endure whatever hardships lay ahead. Standing at the steering oar of the launch, surrounded by 18 men whose lives were now his responsibility, Captain Bligh made the decision that would define the next 47 days of their existence. Instead of attempting to reach nearby islands where they might face hostile natives, he chose to attempt the seemingly impossible, sailing 3,600 miles across the Pacific Ocean to reach the Dutch settlement at Timor. It was a decision that seemed like certain death, but it was also their only realistic hope for survival. The challenge ahead would test every aspect of Bligh's seamanship and leadership while pushing all 19 men to the absolute limits of human endurance.
The morning after the mutiny, as the sun rose over the endless Pacific, Captain Bligh faced a mathematical problem that would determine whether 19 men lived or died. In his head, he calculated distances, wind patterns, current directions, and supply consumption rates with the precision of a man whose life depended on getting the numbers exactly right. The 23-foot launch was never designed for ocean voyaging. Built as a ship's boat for short trips to shore, she was open to the elements, had minimal freeboard, and could be swamped by waves that wouldn't threaten a proper ship. Her small size meant that 19 men were crowded together with barely room to move, let alone seek comfort or privacy. Bligh's first critical decision was the course to steer. The nearest European settlement was the Dutch colony at Timor, over 3,600 nautical miles to the west. The journey would require crossing most of the Pacific Ocean in an open boat, facing storms, hostile waters, and the constant threat of being overwhelmed by waves. Alternative destinations were closer, but more dangerous.
Islands throughout the region were inhabited by peoples who might be hostile to European castaways, and many areas were completely unknown to European navigation. Bligh chose the longest route because it offered the highest probability of reaching civilized help if they could survive the journey. The navigation challenge was enormous. Without accurate charts or a chronometer, Bligh had to rely on dead reckoning, celestial navigation with basic instruments, and his encyclopedic knowledge of Pacific geography gained from years of sailing with Captain Cook. Every calculation had to be perfect, because a navigation error could send them into empty ocean where they would die of thirst and starvation. Bligh established a strict routine that would govern their survival for the next 47 days. Food and water were rationed to precise amounts that would theoretically keep them alive until they reached Timor, but only if consumption was rigidly controlled and no supplies were wasted. The daily water ration was 1/4 pint per man, barely enough to prevent death from dehydration in the tropical heat, but insufficient for comfort or normal hydration. The food ration consisted of an ounce of bread and a small portion of salt pork, providing perhaps 300 calories per day when men performing physical labor needed 3,000 calories to maintain their strength. These rations represented survival at the very edge of human endurance. The men would slowly starve and dehydrate while maintaining just enough nutrition to keep their bodies functioning. It was a calculation that left no margin for error, no allowance for increased consumption, and no possibility of maintaining normal physical capability. The psychological challenge of enforcing these rations was enormous. Hungry, thirsty men faced with starvation rations had to be prevented from consuming supplies that represented the difference between life and death for the entire group. Bligh's authority and discipline, which had caused the mutiny, became essential for preventing panic and hoarding that could doom everyone. The physical discomfort in the overcrowded boat was constant and exhausting. 19 men could not lie down simultaneously, and sleep became a matter of taking turns in cramped, uncomfortable positions. The boat's motion in ocean swells created seasickness that made the food rationing even more challenging, as sick men struggled to keep down their meager meals. Weather became their constant enemy and occasional salvation. Rain provided fresh water that supplemented their meager supplies, but storms threatened to swamp the boat and drown everyone aboard. The open boat offered no protection from sun, wind, or spray, leaving the men constantly exposed to the elements that could kill them gradually or suddenly. Bligh's leadership during these early days established the tone for their entire ordeal. He combined absolute authority over food and water distribution with careful attention to each man's condition and morale. His naval training in managing men under stress proved invaluable for maintaining discipline when lives depended on cooperation. The men's clothing became increasingly important as their journey continued. Constant exposure to salt spray and sun damaged fabric and skin. while the lack of protection from the elements created health problems that could become serious without proper treatment. Every piece of clothing had to be preserved and maintained to provide maximum protection. Navigation required constant attention and calculation. Bligh used every opportunity to take celestial sightings and calculate their position, but the boat's motion made accurate observations difficult. Dead reckoning required careful attention to course, speed, and drift, with small errors potentially sending them hundreds of miles off course. The psychological pressure of responsibility weighed heavily on Bligh, as he realized that every decision could determine the fate of 18 men who had chosen to trust their lives to his leadership. The same perfectionist standards that had made him unpopular as a captain became essential qualities for organizing their survival and maximizing their chances of reaching safety. Equipment maintenance became crucial as their journey progressed. The boat's rigging, steering gear, and hull had to be constantly monitored and repaired to prevent failures that could leave them helpless in the open ocean. Every piece of equipment was essential, and nothing could be allowed to fail without risking everyone's lives. As their first week at sea progressed, the reality of their situation became clear to everyone in the boat. They were committed to a journey that would test human endurance beyond normal limits, with no possibility of rescue or relief until they reached their destination. Their survival would depend entirely on their ability to endure starvation, thirst, exposure, and psychological stress while maintaining the cooperation necessary for sailing the boat. Bligh's brilliant navigation and iron discipline were keeping them alive, but the hardest challenges lay ahead as they sailed deeper into the vast Pacific Ocean with dwindling supplies and weakening bodies.
On May 2nd, 1789, 4 days after being cast adrift, the starving men in Bligh's boat spotted land that seemed like salvation. Tofua, a volcanic island in the Tonga group that promised fresh water, food, and relief from their cramped boat. But what appeared to be their rescue would nearly become their massacre, teaching them that in the Pacific, land could be more dangerous than the open ocean. The island looked inviting from a distance: green hills, flowing water, and what appeared to be coconut palms that could provide both food and drink. After days of starvation rations and constant exposure to sun and spray, the prospect of going ashore seemed like deliverance from their floating hell. But Bligh's experience sailing with Captain Cook had taught him that Pacific islands could be deadly for European castaways. Many island peoples were hostile to outsiders, and even friendly natives might turn violent if they perceived the strangers as a threat or saw opportunities for plunder. Despite the risks, the desperate need for water forced them to attempt a landing. Their water supplies were already critically low after just 4 days, and without replenishment, they would all die of thirst within a week. The mathematical certainty of death from dehydration outweighed the possible danger from islanders. The landing party that went ashore found fresh water and some edible plants, but they also encountered something that chilled Bligh's blood:
evidence of recent violence and warrior culture that suggested the islanders were not peaceful. Weapons, skulls, and other signs indicated that Tofua's inhabitants were prepared for war and might view castaways as enemies or prey. Initially, the contact with islanders seemed promising. The natives appeared curious rather than hostile, and some trading occurred for food and water. But Bligh's naval experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of changing attitudes, and he began to notice that more warriors were gathering, and their demeanor was becoming increasingly aggressive. The crisis came suddenly and without warning. What had been a peaceful trading session erupted into violence as islanders attacked the landing party with clubs and stones. The men were forced to fight for their lives while trying to retreat to their boat, abandoning most of the supplies they had gathered. John Norton, the boat's quartermaster, was killed during the attack, beaten to death by warrior islanders as he tried to protect his shipmates' retreat to the boat. His death was a devastating blow to group morale, and a stark reminder that their survival was threatened by human enemies as well as natural forces. The escape from Tofua was desperate and terrifying. Under a hail of stones and spears, the overloaded boat struggled to get far enough offshore to avoid the warriors who were launching canoes in pursuit. For several hours, they faced the possibility of being overtaken and massacred, saved only by their superior sailing skills and the favorable wind. Norton's death reduced their company to 18 men, but it also taught them a crucial lesson about their survival strategy. Islands that appeared to offer salvation could be death traps for desperate men. Their best hope lay in avoiding all contact with land until they reached European settlement at Timor. Bligh made the momentous decision to sail directly across the open Pacific without attempting to land anywhere else. This decision condemned them to weeks of additional suffering, but also eliminated the risk of hostile encounters that could end their journey in massacre rather than rescue. The psychological impact of Norton's death and their narrow escape from Tofua was profound. The men realized that they were truly alone in a hostile world where death could come from any direction. Their only safety lay in their small boat and the captain's ability to navigate across thousands of miles of empty ocean. The supplies they had lost during the attack at Tofua were irreplaceable, making their already desperate situation even more critical. Every pound of food and every gallon of water was now more precious than gold, and the strict rationing that had seemed harsh before became a matter of life and death survival. Navigation became more critical after leaving Tofua because they were now committed to a course that allowed no room for error. Bligh had to calculate their route through areas where charts were incomplete or non-existent, relying on his memory of sailing with Cook and his mathematical skills to plot a course through dangerous waters. The Great Barrier Reef off the Australian coast represented a navigation nightmare that could destroy their boat and kill everyone on board. Threading through the reef passages required precise positioning and perfect timing, with no margin for error in waters where a miscalculation meant death on coral reefs. Weather patterns in the area they were crossing could be deadly for an open boat. The southeast trade winds that helped drive them toward Timor could also generate storms that would swamp their small craft.
Bligh had to balance speed toward their destination against the risk of sailing into weather conditions that could kill them. The constant threat of being overwhelmed by waves created psychological stress that wore on everyone in the boat. Large swells could break over them without warning, filling the boat with water that had to be bailed out while maintaining course and sail handling. Each wave that crashed over them reminded the men how easily they could be drowned. Sleep became increasingly difficult as their journey continued and their physical condition deteriorated. The combination of hunger, thirst, cramped conditions, and constant motion made rest nearly impossible. But exhaustion also made it dangerous for men to handle the boat in heavy weather. The social dynamics in the boat began to show strain as hunger and desperation affected everyone's judgment and temperament. Bligh had to manage personality conflicts and maintain discipline among men who were slowly starving while performing the complex teamwork necessary for sailing their boat. As they sailed away from the site of Norton's death, the 18 survivors faced the knowledge that they were now truly committed to one of the most ambitious survival journeys ever attempted. They had no choice but to trust Bligh's navigation and their collective endurance to carry them across 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean to safety, or to death in the attempt. The islands they passed in the distance looked like paradise, but they had learned that paradise could be a death trap for desperate men. Their salvation lay not in the land they could see, but in the empty horizon ahead, where skill and determination might carry them to the only place in the Pacific where Europeans could find safety.
By their second week at sea, the 18 survivors in Bligh's boat had entered a state of slow starvation that would test the very limits of human endurance. The daily rations that had seemed barely adequate when their journey began now felt like a cruel joke played by mathematics against biology as their bodies began consuming themselves to stay alive. Each man's daily allowance consisted of 1/25 of a pound of bread, roughly the size of a modern dinner roll, and a piece of salt pork no larger than a child's thumb. This provided perhaps 200 to 300 calories per day when men performing the physical labor of sailing a boat in harsh conditions needed 3,000 calories just to maintain their body weight. The psychological torture of measuring out these tiny rations was almost unbearable. Bligh divided the food with scientific precision, using scales improvised from their equipment to ensure absolute fairness. Every crumb was accounted for, every portion measured exactly, because the difference of an ounce could mean the difference between life and death for the group. Water rationing was even more critical and more psychologically devastating. Each man received 1 gill of water per day, exactly 1/4 of a pint, or about 4 ounces. In the tropical heat, constantly exposed to sun and salt spray, this amount was barely sufficient to prevent death from dehydration, but it was nowhere near enough to prevent the constant torture of thirst. The men developed elaborate rituals around their meager meals, trying to make the tiny portions last as long as possible. They would break their bread into minute pieces, eating 1 crumb at a time while savoring every grain. Some would save their entire daily ration until evening, while others consumed it immediately to end the anticipation that was almost worse than the hunger. Sleep became nearly impossible as hunger gnawed at their stomachs and thirst parched their throats. The men would lie awake at night, cramped together in the boat, listening to each other's breathing and wondering who would be the first to die from starvation.
The sound of the ocean around them became a constant reminder that death surrounded them on all sides. Their bodies began showing the devastating effects of prolonged starvation. Weight loss was dramatic and visible. Faces became gaunt, eyes sunken, and cheekbones prominent as their bodies consumed muscle and fat to maintain vital functions. Clothing that had been tight when they started the journey now hung loose on skeletal frames. The physical symptoms of starvation intensified as their ordeal continued. Weakness made even simple tasks exhausting, while dizziness and confusion affected their ability to perform the complex teamwork necessary for sailing the boat. Men who had been strong sailors became barely able to handle the ropes and sails that kept them moving toward salvation. Scurvy began to appear as their diet, already inadequate in calories, provided no vitamin C to prevent the disease that had killed countless sailors. Their gums became swollen and painful, while old wounds refused to heal and new injuries became infected easily. Some men developed the characteristic rash and joint pain that marked the disease's progression. The salt water that constantly soaked them created additional health problems as their skin became raw and infected from prolonged exposure to the sea. Saltwater sores developed on everyone's body, creating painful wounds that could not heal properly due to malnutrition and constant re-exposure to the sea. Bligh's leadership during this period was extraordinary and probably saved multiple lives. He maintained absolute discipline over food and water distribution, while also serving as doctor, navigator, and motivational leader for men who were slowly dying under his command. His own suffering was as severe as anyone's, but he never showed weakness or doubt. The psychological pressure of command was enormous for Bligh, as he watched his men slowly deteriorate while maintaining hope that his navigation calculations were correct. Every day of their journey could be their last if his estimates of distance or timing were wrong, and the weight of 18 lives rested entirely on his shoulders. Hallucinations began to affect some of the men as starvation and dehydration took their toll on brain function. Men would see land on the horizon that wasn't there, or imagine they smelled cooking food, or believe they were back home with their families. These episodes were frightening for everyone and dangerous for navigation if the hallucinating men tried to change course. The mental discipline required to maintain hope under such circumstances was remarkable. They had to believe that their suffering had purpose, that Bligh knew where he was going, and that rescue lay ahead rather than death in empty ocean. This faith was tested daily as their condition worsened and no land appeared. Equipment maintenance became increasingly difficult as the men's strength failed, but it was also more critical than ever. A broken mast or damaged sail could leave them helpless in the ocean, unable to make progress toward safety. Bligh insisted on constant attention to the boat's condition, despite their weakness and the pain of working with raw, infected hands. Navigation required constant vigilance and calculation, but Bligh's instruments were affected by the harsh conditions just as his men were. Salt spray damaged his quadrant, while the boat's motion made accurate celestial observations increasingly difficult. Every calculation had to be perfect, because an error could send them into empty ocean, where they would die before correcting course. The social dynamics in the boat began to show dangerous strain, as hunger and despair affected everyone's judgment and emotional control. Arguments broke out over insignificant matters, while some men withdrew into themselves and others became irritable and aggressive. Bligh had to manage these conflicts while maintaining the teamwork essential for sailing their boat. Religious faith became important for many of the men as they faced what seemed like certain death. They held prayers and religious services, seeking divine intervention and comfort in the belief that their suffering had spiritual meaning.
These observances helped maintain morale and group cohesion during the darkest periods of their ordeal. By their 4th week at sea, the men had lost so much weight and strength that their survival seemed miraculous on a daily basis. They were living proof that human beings could endure starvation and thirst far beyond what medical science considered possible, sustained by nothing more than hope and Bligh's unwavering determination to reach safety. As they sailed deeper into the Pacific, still over 1,000 miles from their destination, the men faced the terrifying possibility that they had already exceeded human endurance limits and might die just short of rescue. But they also carried the knowledge that they had survived longer than seemed possible, and that each day of continued existence brought them closer to safety, if they could just hold on long enough for Bligh's navigation to prove correct.
On June 12, 1789, after 47 days that had seemed like an eternity of suffering, the impossible words were finally spoken. Land ho! The man who spotted the coastline of Timor could barely summon the strength to call out, but his words electrified the skeletal figures huddled in Bligh's boat. After sailing 3,618 nautical miles across the Pacific Ocean, they had reached safety. The men who stared at the approaching coastline bore little resemblance to the sailors who had been cast adrift 7 weeks earlier. They were walking skeletons, their clothes hanging in tatters, their skin burned and raw from constant exposure to sun and salt. Some could barely sit upright, while others were delirious from starvation and dehydration. But they were alive, and they had accomplished one of the most remarkable feats of navigation and survival in maritime history. Bligh's calculations had been nearly perfect. After 47 days of sailing with basic instruments across 3,600 miles of ocean, he had brought them within sight of their intended destination. The approach to Timor presented one final challenge that nearly ended their ordeal in disaster. The Dutch settlement at Kupang was located on a specific part of the island's coast, and finding it required precise navigation along an unfamiliar shoreline. A mistake could leave them wrecked on reefs or force them to attempt a dangerous landing on hostile shores. Bligh's seamanship during these final hours was masterful. Despite his own exhaustion and the boat's deteriorated condition, he managed to navigate along the coast until they found Kupang Harbor. The sight of European ships and buildings in the harbor was the most beautiful vision any of them had ever seen. The Dutch officials at Kupang could hardly believe what they were seeing when Bligh's boat approached the harbor. Here were 18 men who looked like they had risen from the dead, arriving in a boat that should have sunk weeks earlier, claiming to have sailed across the Pacific Ocean from the site of a mutiny. Captain Bligh's first words to the Dutch authorities were characteristically precise and focused. "I am Captain Bligh of His Majesty's ship Bounty. We have been cast adrift by mutineers and have sailed here from near Tahiti." Even in his extremity, he maintained the formal bearing and clear communication that had served him throughout his naval career. The medical assessment of the survivors revealed the full extent of their ordeal. They had lost an average of 40 pounds per man, reducing them to skeletal frames that could barely support basic life functions. Their skin was severely damaged by sun exposure and salt water, while many showed signs of scurvy and other diseases related to malnutrition. But perhaps most remarkably,
all 18 men who had survived the journey were mentally coherent and able to provide detailed accounts of their experience. Despite the physical devastation, their minds had remained clear enough to function as a crew throughout their ordeal, testament to both their individual resilience and Bligh's leadership. The Dutch officials provided immediate medical care and hospitality that probably saved several lives. Fresh food, clean water, medical attention, and shelter allowed the survivors to begin the slow process of physical recovery, but the psychological impact of their experience would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Food became an obsession for the survivors during their recovery. After weeks of starvation rations, the abundance of fresh food at Kupang seemed miraculous, but their shrunken stomachs and damaged digestive systems required careful management to prevent dangerous complications from rapid refeeding. The story of their survival quickly spread throughout the Dutch colony and beyond, creating international sensation when news reached Europe. The idea that 18 men had survived 47 days in an open boat while sailing 3,600 miles across the Pacific Ocean seemed almost impossible to believe, but the survivors' presence at Kupang proved it had happened. Captain Bligh's reputation was transformed overnight from mutiny victim to survival hero. His navigation skills, leadership under extreme pressure, and ability to keep 18 men alive through impossible circumstances established him as one of the great figures in maritime history. The detailed log that Bligh had maintained throughout their ordeal provided precise documentation of one of history's most remarkable survival stories. His daily records of position, weather, rations, and crew condition created a scientific record that allowed others to study and understand their achievement. The physical recovery of the survivors was gradual but generally successful. Most regained their health and strength over the following months, though some carried permanent effects from their ordeal. The psychological recovery was more complex, with some men struggling for years with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The Dutch authorities assisted in arranging passage back to England for the survivors, but the journey home would take many months and present its own challenges. The men who had survived the Pacific crossing now faced the task of returning to normal life and dealing with the fame and scrutiny their survival had created. Bligh used his time at Kupang to prepare detailed reports for the Royal Navy about the mutiny, their survival, and the remarkable navigation that had brought them to safety. These reports would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings against the mutineers and would establish the official record of their experience. The boat that had carried them across 3,600 miles of Pacific Ocean was preserved by the Dutch as a historical artifact, testament to the remarkable achievement of navigation and survival that it represented. The small craft that seemed impossibly fragile for ocean voyaging had proven capable of one of the greatest journeys in maritime history. As they prepared to leave Timor and begin their journey back to England, the 18 survivors carried with them knowledge that few humans had ever possessed. They had faced death for 47 days and had refused to surrender. They had proven that extraordinary leadership, precise navigation, and unwavering determination could overcome circumstances that seemed designed to kill them. Their survival would inspire countless others facing impossible odds, while Bligh's navigation would be studied by maritime experts for generations as an example of seamanship at its finest. The men who had been cast adrift to die, instead accomplished one of the most remarkable survival stories in human history.
Captain William Bligh's return to England in March 1790 transformed him from a naval officer known primarily for his difficult personality into one of the most celebrated heroes in British maritime history. The story of his 3,600-mile survival journey captured the public imagination and established him as the epitome of British seamanship and determination under impossible circumstances. The Royal Navy's investigation into the Bounty mutiny confirmed Bligh's account and absolved him of responsibility for the uprising. The court-martial proceedings revealed that his leadership during the survival journey had been exemplary, and his navigation had been nothing short of genius. The same demanding standards that had contributed to the mutiny had also saved 18 lives. But Bligh's heroic reputation came at a personal cost that would affect him for the rest of his life. The physical ordeal had taken a permanent toll on his health, while the psychological trauma of watching men slowly starve under his command created emotional scars that never fully healed. He had saved lives, but the experience had changed him fundamentally. The scientific aspects of Bligh's navigation became subjects of intense study by maritime experts and navigational schools. His ability to calculate position and course with basic instruments while under extreme stress represented seamanship at its finest. His techniques were analyzed and taught to generations of naval officers as examples of professional excellence. The survival itself challenged contemporary understanding of human endurance limits. Medical experts of the time considered it impossible for men to survive 47 days on starvation rations while performing the physical labor necessary to sail a boat across thousands of miles of ocean. Bligh's achievement expanded knowledge about human capacity for survival under extreme conditions. The detailed records that Bligh maintained throughout their ordeal provided unprecedented documentation of a survival experience. His daily log entries, recording position, weather, rations, and crew condition, created a scientific record that allowed researchers to analyze exactly how they had managed to survive circumstances that should have killed them. The psychological aspects of their survival were equally remarkable and became subjects of study for experts in human behavior under stress. The maintenance of discipline, cooperation, and hope among 18 starving men in a small boat represented group psychology under extreme conditions that few researchers had ever been able to document. Bligh's leadership style during the survival journey was analyzed and contrasted with his pre-mutiny command approach. The same demanding perfectionism that had alienated his crew during normal ship operations had proven essential for organizing their survival efforts and maintaining the discipline necessary for group survival. The story became a cautionary tale about leadership and authority that was studied by military organizations, management experts, and leadership training programs. Bligh's experience demonstrated both the importance of strong leadership in crisis situations and the dangers of authoritarian styles that alienate subordinates during normal operations. The mutineers' fate added a tragic dimension to the story that reinforced its moral lessons. Some were eventually captured and tried for treason, with several executed for their roles in the mutiny. Others lived as fugitives in the Pacific, never able to return to civilization. Fletcher Christian died young on Pitcairn Island, never knowing whether Bligh had survived the ordeal he had created. Popular culture embraced the bounty story, but often distorted its lessons and facts.
Books, plays, and eventually movies portrayed Bligh as either a heroic navigator or a tyrannical villain, depending on the political and social attitudes of different eras. The complex reality of his character and leadership was often lost in simplified narratives designed for entertainment. The navigational achievement itself remained unmatched in maritime history for its combination of distance, duration, and survival against impossible odds. While other survival journeys might equal or exceed individual aspects of Bligh's voyage, none combined all the elements that made his achievement unique. The boat that carried them across the Pacific became a symbol of human determination and skillful seamanship. Replicas were built and displayed in museums around the world, while maritime artists created paintings and sculptures commemorating the voyage. The small craft that had seemed hopelessly inadequate for ocean voyaging became an icon of survival against impossible odds. Educational institutions used Bligh's story to teach navigation, seamanship, and crisis management. Naval academies studied his techniques, while business schools analyzed his leadership approach. The lessons learned from 47 days of survival became applicable to many fields beyond maritime navigation. The medical aspects of their survival contributed to understanding of human nutrition, dehydration, and the body's adaptation to extreme stress. Their experience provided data about starvation survival that influenced emergency ration planning and survival training for military and civilian applications. Modern survival experts continue to study Bligh's achievement for insights into group survival psychology, resource management under extreme scarcity, and leadership in life-or-death situations. His experience remains relevant for anyone facing circumstances where cooperation and discipline are essential for survival. The story's enduring appeal lies in its demonstration that ordinary human beings can accomplish extraordinary things when their survival depends on refusing to surrender to impossible circumstances. Bligh and his men proved that with proper leadership, precise skills, and unwavering determination, people can overcome challenges that seem designed to destroy them. Their 47-day ordeal stands as one of the greatest survival achievements in human history, a testament to the power of navigation skills, disciplined leadership, and the human refusal to accept death as inevitable. They transformed what should have been certain death into one of the most remarkable survival stories ever documented. Most importantly, Bligh's survival journey demonstrates that leadership in crisis requires different qualities than leadership in normal circumstances. The same traits that can make someone difficult to work with during routine operations, perfectionism, attention to detail, unwillingness to compromise standards, can become essential for survival when lives depend on getting everything exactly right. Captain William Bligh proved that sometimes the most demanding leaders are exactly what people need when everything depends on refusing to give up, maintaining discipline, and navigating through circumstances that offer no margin for error. His 3,600-mile journey across the Pacific remains a masterpiece of seamanship and a testament to what humans can accomplish when they absolutely refuse to surrender to seemingly impossible odds.
And that's the incredible true story of Captain Bligh's 3,600-mile survival journey, one of the greatest feats of navigation and leadership under pressure in maritime history. You know, what strikes me most about this story is how it completely flips the Hollywood version we all think we know. We've been told that Bligh was a tyrant, that the mutiny was justified, that he was the villain of the story. But when you look at what actually happened after the mutiny, when you see him navigate 3,600 miles of open ocean with basic instruments and keep 18 men alive on starvation rations for 47 days, you realize you're looking at one of the most remarkable leaders in history. Think about this for a moment. Bligh calculated their course across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean with an 18th century quadrant and compass with no GPS, no radio, no weather forecasts. He had to get the math exactly right because one mistake would have sent them into empty ocean, where they'd all die of thirst. And he nailed it. After 47 days, he brought them within sight of their intended destination. But the navigation was only part of it. The leadership challenge was even more incredible. Imagine trying to maintain discipline and hope among 18 starving men in a 23-foot boat for 7 weeks. These men were literally dying of hunger and thirst, hallucinating from dehydration, watching each other waste away. Yet Bligh kept them working together, kept them believing in rescue, kept them human. Here's what really gets me. The same qualities that made Bligh unpopular during normal ship operations were exactly what saved their lives during the survival crisis. His perfectionism, his attention to detail, his refusal to compromise standards. These weren't character flaws when their lives depended on getting everything exactly right. And those rations? 1 ounce of bread and a sliver of salt pork per day. That's maybe 300 calories when they needed 3,000. Yet somehow, through mathematical precision and iron discipline, Bligh made those impossible rations last long enough to keep everyone alive until rescue. I think about Bligh's story whenever I hear someone complain about demanding leadership or high standards. Because sometimes, when everything is on the line, when lives depend on excellence, when there's no margin for error, that's exactly the kind of leadership that saves lives. Their story also shows us something profound about human endurance. These men survived 47 days in conditions that medical experts said should have killed them in a week. They proved that the human body and spirit can endure far more than we think possible when survival depends on refusing to give up. So here's my question for you. What impossible navigation challenge are you facing in your own life? What situation requires you to maintain perfect discipline and never give up determination, even when everything seems hopeless? Because Bligh's story proves that with precise planning, unwavering leadership, and absolute refusal to surrender, we can navigate through circumstances that seem designed to destroy us. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. What part of Bligh's survival story amazed you most? Have you ever been in a situation where demanding leadership made the difference between success and disaster? And what survival story would you like me to cover next? If Captain Bligh's incredible 47-day journey across the Pacific kept you engaged, please hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these amazing stories of leadership and survival against impossible odds. And make sure you're subscribed to Hold On Survival Stories with notifications turned on. Coming up, we have more incredible tales of people who faced certain death and found ways to navigate through, who discovered that human determination and precise skills can overcome challenges that seem insurmountable. Until next time, remember Captain Bligh's lesson from the Pacific. When you're facing impossible odds, when your resources are nearly exhausted, when everyone is counting on your leadership, that's when you find out what you're really made of. Sometimes the most demanding standards are exactly what you need when there's no room for anything less than perfection. This has been Hold On Survival Stories. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey of seamanship, leadership, and survival against all odds. And I'll see you in the next one.